French Connection, The Conversation, Superman. Gene Hackman has died at the age of 95.
When two maintenance workers arrived at a quiet, sprawling estate in Santa Fe, New Mexico, they had no reason to believe that day would be any different from any other routine job. They pulled up to the property, gathered their tools, and walked toward the front entrance, expecting nothing unusual. But what greeted them stopped them cold. The front door was wide open, not slightly ajar, not cracked, wide open, as if someone had left in a hurry, or perhaps never left at all. They stepped inside and called out. No answer. They moved further in, and within moments, any sense of an ordinary workday vanished completely. What they found inside that grand New Mexico home would shake investigators, stun Hollywood, and leave millions of people around the world searching desperately for answers. The property belonged to Gene Hackman, one of the greatest actors ever to grace the silver screen, a two-time Academy Award winner, a man who had played cops and criminals, heroes and villains, with equal conviction and magnetic force. He was 95 years old, and along with his wife Betsy Arakawa, he had been living quietly in retirement in Santa Fe for years, far from the flashbulbs and red carpets that had once defined his world. But on that day when the maintenance workers pushed open that front door, Gene Hackman and Betsy Arakawa were no longer living at all. They were gone, and had apparently been gone for a long, long time. The discovery sent immediate shockwaves through law enforcement. Authorities arrived on scene and began piecing together a picture that none of them had anticipated. Both bodies showed advanced signs of decomposition. Investigators who had spent entire careers walking through crime scenes and examining the aftermath of human tragedy were visibly shaken. The level of decay suggested the couple had not simply passed away the night before or even the week before. The deterioration pointed to a far longer period, days, possibly weeks, during which two of the most recognizable names in Hollywood history had lain undiscovered inside their own home, surrounded by silence and slowly being reclaimed by time. What made the scene even more unsettling was not just the state of the bodies, but the strange and disorienting details scattered throughout the house. Near Gene Hackman, investigators found a cane and a pair of sunglasses resting on the floor nearby, as though he had simply lost his footing and never gotten back up. He was found in a small room close to a back entrance, not in a bedroom, not in a comfortable chair, but in what appeared to be an afterthought of room, a transitional space that said nothing about rest and everything about something going terribly wrong without warning. Betsy Arakawa was discovered in the bathroom on the opposite side of the house, which immediately raised questions. Why were they so far apart? What had happened in those final moments that separated a couple from each other in what may have been the last hours of their lives? The bathroom where Betsy was found added even more weight to the mystery. Scattered across the counter were pills. An open prescription bottle sat nearby, its contents disturbed. A space heater had been knocked over. The scene was not clean, not peaceful, not the image of two elderly people quietly slipping away together. It was chaotic in its own quiet way, the kind of disorder that speaks to urgency, to panic, to something going wrong fast. Investigators couldn't immediately determine whether she had been reaching for medication in a moment of crisis, whether she had been unwell for some time, or whether something far darker had unfolded in that room. But perhaps the detail that shook people most deeply was not the bodies themselves. It was the animals. The couple had 3 pets in the home. 2 dogs had somehow survived, found wandering loose on the property when workers arrived, confused, frightened, but alive. The 3rd dog, however, was discovered dead inside a crate. That single image, a small animal trapped, unable to escape, unable to reach food or water, dying alone in a confined space, told investigators something critical. It told them that no one had come. No one had checked on the house. No one had walked through that door in a very long time. The survival of the 2 dogs outside suggested that at some point, water or food may have been loosely accessible to them. But the dog in the crate had no such luck. And if that dog had been in there long enough to perish, then the timeline of the couple's death stretched back far further than anyone initially wanted to believe. Early speculation from officials pointed toward carbon monoxide poisoning. It seemed on the surface like the kind of quiet, invisible killer that could take 2 people without leaving a mark, without a struggle, without any outward evidence of foul play. The The New Mexico Gas Company was called to inspect every line, every connection, every possible source of leakage throughout the property. Investigators waited for results that they hoped would bring clarity. But when those results came back, they brought no relief, only more confusion. There was no gas leak. There was no carbon monoxide. The invisible killer theory evaporated, and in its place stood something far more difficult to define. The absence of carbon monoxide forced investigators to look harder, think differently, and approach the case from entirely new angles. Autopsies were ordered. Toxicology reports were requested. Phone records were pulled. Medical histories were subpoenaed. Anyone who had been in contact with Gene Hackman or Betsy Arakawa in the days and weeks before their deaths became a person of interest, not because there was evidence of wrongdoing, but because the case had grown strange enough that nothing could be dismissed outright. One seasoned investigator, a man who had worked through thousands of death cases across decades of service, said bluntly that the scene simply did not add up. Two people dying at or around the same time, with no immediately obvious cause, in different rooms, with no signs of forced entry and no clear medical event. He had never seen anything quite like it. Among the theories that began circulating in both official channels and the public imagination, several stood out. One possibility was that the deaths were entirely natural, that Gene Hackman, at 95, had simply reached the end of a long and remarkable life, and that Betsy, finding him or knowing he was gone, had experienced a catastrophic medical event of her own. The human body, when confronted with sudden, devastating grief, can react in extreme and unexpected ways. Hearts falter, systems shut down. For people who have spent decades bound to each other in love and partnership, the loss of one can, in some cases, precipitate the rapid decline of the other. But this theory, while emotionally resonant, still left questions unanswered, particularly about the arrangement of the scene, the open door, and the timeline of discovery. Another theory suggested the possibility of a joint decision, that two people facing serious health concerns, aware of their own mortality, may have chosen to leave together rather than apart. And yet this theory, too, crumbled under scrutiny. In cases where people make that choice together, there's almost always evidence of intention, a note, a particular arrangement of space, some deliberate act that says this was decided in advance. There was none of that here. And the fact that the two were found in entirely different rooms made the idea of a shared and intentional final act difficult to support. A third and darker possibility, the one that investigators have refused to fully close the door on, is that someone else was involved. The front door being open did not necessarily mean that Gene or Betsy had opened it themselves. There were no signs of forced entry, which could mean many things. It could mean no one broke in, or it could mean that whoever entered was let in willingly, without surveillance footage, without witnesses, without a definitive timeline of who last saw the couple alive, and when that door remained open in more ways than one. Gene Hackman's daughter Leslie Ann Hackman spoke to the press in the days following the discovery, describing her father as a man who had remained physically active well into his later years. He did Pilates. He practiced yoga. She emphasized that despite his age, he had not been in obvious decline, had not undergone any major surgeries recently, and had seemed, to those who knew him, like a man still very much engaged with living. This made the suddenness of his death all the more startling. Leslie also spoke warmly about Betsy Arakawa, crediting her with being the cornerstone of her father's health and well-being during his retirement years. Betsy, she said, was always watching over him, always making sure he was cared for, always present. She was only 63 years old. Her death, in many ways, generated even more painful questions in Gene's, because 63 is not old. 63 is not the end of natural arc 60. 3 demands an explanation. For those who had followed Gene Hackman's career across more than 5 decades, the grief was deep and genuine. His work was not the work of a man who coasted on charisma or relied on star power to carry weak performances. He was a craftsman, methodical, committed, endlessly curious about the human beings he was asked to portray. He had been rejected early in his career, dismissed by classmates at acting school as someone unlikely to succeed, told in various ways that he didn't have what it took. And he had taken every rejection, every closed door, every dismissive review, and used it as fuel. By the time he stood on stage accepting his first Academy Award for French Connection in 1972, he had already proven every doubter wrong. By the time he collected his second Oscar for Unforgiven 20 years later, he had built a body of work that placed him in the same conversation as the greatest actors of the 20th century. Clint Eastwood, who directed Hackman in Unforgiven and counted him as a close friend, released a statement that spoke to both the professional brilliance and the personal warmth of the man he had known for so long. He described Hackman's performances as real and powerful, never less than perfect, and said that beyond the work, he was losing a genuine friend. Morgan Freeman, who also starred in Unforgiven alongside Hackman, joined the chorus of grief pouring out from every corner of Hollywood. Gwyneth Paltrow, who had worked with him on the Royal Tenenbaums, posted a tribute that needed no words beyond a photograph and a broken heart. But behind all of that grief, behind the flood of memories and the celebration of a career that had moved and entertained and challenged millions of people, the questions remained. The house in Santa Fe held its secrets stubbornly. The bodies, found in states of advanced decomposition, had been inside those walls for far longer than anyone should have been allowed to remain undiscovered. And the details of the scene, the open door, the scattered pills, the overturned heater, the dead dog and crate, the cane on the floor, all of it combined to form a picture that no one could yet read clearly. Investigators continued working through the evidence carefully and methodically. Phone records were being examined to determine when the last communications were made and received. Medical files were being reviewed for any diagnoses or prescriptions that might explain what happened inside that house. Toxicology results, which can take weeks or even months to return in full, were being awaited with a kind of anxious tension that stretched from the Santa Fe Police Department all the way to every newsroom and living room where people had grown up watching Gene Hackman on screen and felt, in some way, that they knew him. What is perhaps most haunting about this story is not the mystery itself, but the silence surrounding it. Gene Hackman had spent the last years of his life deliberately and successfully removed from public scrutiny. He gave no interviews. He made no appearances. The last time he was photographed in public had been years earlier, outside a restaurant, leaning on a cane, his wife holding his arm. He looked older than people remembered him, and also somehow still himself. Still the sharp eyes, still the jaw that had carried 100 hard-edged characters across the screen. He had chosen privacy, and privacy had been given to him. But that same privacy, that same deliberate distance from the world, meant that when something went wrong inside that quiet mansion, there was no one watching, no one checking, no alarm that sounded. The full truth of what happened to Gene Hackman and Betsy Arakawa remains, for now, locked somewhere between the evidence still being gathered and the tests still being processed. What the authorities know for certain is that 2 people died inside a home that meant something to them, in a state that left even experienced investigators shaken, under circumstances that have not yet yielded to easy explanation. What the world knows is that a man who spent his life making audiences feel something real is gone, and that the woman who spent her later years devoted to his care and well-being is gone with him. And what everyone who has followed the story knows, from the investigators in Santa Fe to the fans who grew up watching Gene Hackman on screen, is that the full story has not yet been told, and that whatever it turns out to be, it will be as complicated and as human as any role he ever played.